queen sat sewing by her window on a snowy winter's day, and she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell into the snow on the windowsill. And she thought to herself, "Oh, that I could have a child who was as white as snow, and as red as blood, and as black as the wood of this window frame." Well, a short time later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl who was as white as snow, and as red as blood, and as black as ebony wood. And the queen named her child Snow White, but then promptly died, having given birth to her. Well, a year later, the king took for himself a new wife, and she was a beautiful woman, but she was also vain and arrogant. She had a magic mirror, and every day she would stand before her mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of all." And she would be satisfied, for she knew the mirror could only speak the truth. However, on Snow White's 7th birthday, the queen once again stood before her mirror and asked the question, but this time the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but young Snow White is yet more fair than you." And she became green with envy, and she knew that she would have no rest until Snow White was dead. So the queen called to her side a huntsman, and she told him to take Snow White deep into the forest and to kill her and cut out her lungs and liver as proof that she was dead. So the huntsman did as he was told, and he took the child far, far into the forest, and he took out his knife and was just about to plunge it into the child's heart when Snow White fell to the ground and began to weep and begged him to have mercy. And she was so lovely that the huntsman couldn't bear to harm her. And so he told Snow White to run off into the forest and to never come back. As the huntsman was returning to the castle, a wild boar ran into his path, and so the huntsman killed the boar instead and cut out its lungs and liver, and this is what he presented to the queen as proof of Snow White's death. And the queen took the organs and gave them to the castle chef and had them cooked up with a little bit of salt and pepper, and that was what she ate for her dinner that night, believing that she ate the lungs and liver of her stepchild. Because Grimm. Well, meanwhile, Snow White ran through the forest until it began to get dark, and she was very, very frightened until she came across a small cottage. And she knocked at the door, but nobody entered, so she let herself in and saw a little table with 7 little plates and 7 little cups. And she ate a little food from each plate, and she drank a little wine from each cup, and feeling very tired, she decided to go find a bed. And she went into the bedroom where there were 7 little beds, and she chose one and fell prompt asleep. Well, that night, the owners of the cottage came home, and it was the 7 dwarves who spent their days mining for gold in the mountains. And they were very surprised to see that somebody had been eating their dinner and drinking their wine. And of course, when they went into the bedroom and they saw the child lying there, they all gathered around, but she was so lovely that they could not stand to wake her. So they just stood there and stared at her for a little while. Well, eventually Snow White woke up, and she was very, very frightened, because that's super creepy. But the dwarves said, "Don't be afraid, we won't harm you. How have you come to be in our cottage?" And Snow White told them the story of how her stepmother had tried to kill her. And the dwarves said, "You are more than welcome to stay with us, as long as you do the cooking and the cleaning and the mending and all of the things that a young lady should do." And Snow White thought, well, I'm probably not going to get any better offers, so she agreed. Well, meanwhile, back at the castle, the queen the next day once again stood in front of her mirror and asked the question, and this time the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but over the mountains where the 7 dwarves dwell, young Snow White is still alive and well." And she became furious when she realized that the huntsman had tricked her, and she vowed that she would find a way to kill Snow White once and for all. So the queen dressed herself as an old peddler woman, and she traveled through the forest until she arrived at the cottage, and she called out, "Wares for sale, beautiful wares for sale." And Snow White came to the door and asked what she had for sale, and the queen pulled out the most beautiful silken stay laces that Snow White had ever seen, and she desperately wanted them. So they agreed on a price, But the queen said, "Oh, but you look a fright, child. You must let me lace you up like a proper young lady." And Snow White agreed, and the queen began to lace her up, but she tied the laces so tight that Snow White could no longer breathe, and she fell to the ground as if dead. Luckily, the dwarves arrived home not long after, and when they saw Snow White lying there, they immediately knew what the problem was, and they cut off the laces, and Snow White was revived. And she told them about the old woman, and the dwarves immediately knew that it was none other than her wicked stepmother that had tried to kill her. And the dwarves said, "Snow White, you must not let anybody else into this cottage." And Snow White agreed. Well, thanks to her magic mirror, the queen soon realized that she had once again failed. So she concocted a new plan, and using the power of witchcraft, she created the most beautiful diamond comb. But the tines of the comb were poisoned. And once again, she dressed as an old peddler woman and traveled through the forest to the cottage and called out, "Where is for sale?" And this time Snow White came to the window and said, "I'm sorry, but the dwarves have forbidden me to let anybody inside." And the queen said, "That's fine, I can show you what I have from here." And she pulled out the diamond comb, and it was the most beautiful comb that Snow White had ever seen, and she desperately wanted it. So they agreed on a price, and the queen said, "Oh, but you look terrible, child. You must let me comb your hair like a proper young lady." And she began to comb Snow White's hair, but one of the tines pricked Snow White's scalp, and she fell to the ground as if dead. Luckily, the dwarves arrived home not long after, and they searched Snow White's body and they found the comb, and as soon as they had pulled it from her hair, Snow White was once again revived. And the dwarves said, "Seriously, Snow White, you've got to stop letting people into this cottage." And she said, "Okay." Well, soon the queen once again realized that she had failed, and this time she concocted a plan that was sure to kill Snow White once and for all. And she went down into the deepest depths of her castle where she did her most evil deeds. And she created an apple that was half red and half white. And it was so delicious looking that anybody who saw it would long to eat it. But half of the apple was poisoned. Once again, she dressed herself as an old peddler woman. There it is, right there. It looked just like that. And she traveled through the forest until she arrived at the cottage and called out, "Apples for sale." And Snow White came to the window and said, "I'm sorry, the dwarves won't let me let anybody inside." And she said, "That's fine. I only wondered if you might want this delicious-looking apple." And Snow White saw the apple and she thought, "That looks like a really good apple." But I have had such horrible luck lately with these old peddler women that I really should not eat it, but thank you. And the queen said, "But are you afraid of poison? Here, I will cut the apple in half, and I shall eat the white half, and you shall eat the red." And when Snow White saw her eating the apple, she thought surely it could not be poisoned. And Snow White took her half of the apple and took a bite, and no sooner had the bite passed through her lips than she fell to the ground dead. And the queen returned to her castle feeling very proud of herself. And she once again stood before her mirror and asked her question, and this time the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest of all." And finally her heart was at rest. Well, when the dwarves came home that night, they did everything they possibly could to revive Snow White, but she would not wake up, and they thought surely they had lost her forever. And they sat and they cried over her for 3 days. But Snow White always went on looking as if she were merely sleeping. And the dwarves thought, "We cannot possibly bury her in the dark, cold ground." So being expert craftsmen, the dwarves built for her a beautiful glass coffin so that she could be seen from all sides. And they put her in a meadow in the forest, and even the beasts of the forest came to mourn for her. And the years passed, but Snow White always went on looking as if she were merely sleeping. Until one day, a prince happened to be wandering aimlessly through the forest. Which, if you read many fairy tales, you might know that's what princes do. And he happened to come across Snow White, and he thought, "Oh, she is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and I love her dearly." And he begged the dwarves to let him take Snow White back to his castle. And the dwarves took pity on him and agreed. And the prince got down on one knee, and he leaned over Snow White, and he gave her a romantic kiss. except I'm totally lying. It didn't happen at all. What actually happened is that the prince told his servants to take Snow White back to the castle. And so his servants hoisted the coffin up on their shoulders, and they began marching back to the castle. But one of the servants tripped, and the coffin went flying and crashed, and the piece of apple burst out of Snow White's throat, and she woke up. Because all she really needed was the Heimlich maneuver. And Snow White sat up and looked around and thought, goodness, where am I? And the prince went to her and said, you are with me, and I love you dearly. You must come back and be my wife. And she thought, that sounded like a pretty good deal, so she agreed. Well, on the day of the wedding, the evil queen once again stood before her mirror, wearing her finest gown, and asked, mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of them all? And the mirror replied, you, my queen, are fair, it is true, but the new queen is 1,000 times more fair than you. Burn. And the queen became furious, and she had to go see who this new queen was. So she went to the wedding, and when she saw that it was none other than Snow White, who she was sure she had killed, she became frozen with horror. Well, Snow White and the prince had been expecting her, and they had had a pair of special iron shoes crafted. And all day those shoes had been sitting in the hottest coals of the fire until they were glowing white hot. And the evil queen was forced to strap the iron shoes onto her feet and dance as their wedding entertainment until she fell down dead. The end.